Along the frozen coast of Maine, a retired Navy SEAL lived in silence, haunted by the war he couldn't forget and the brothers he couldn't forgive. One stormy night, the tide brought him something unexpected, a wounded German shepherd clinging to the rocks. He saved the animal, not knowing it had escaped from the ghosts of his own past. Days later, as the dog healed, it began to act strange, staring toward the fog-covered cliffs, whining with a desperate urgency. When the SEAL finally followed, the dog led him through the mist, straight to an abandoned lighthouse that hadn't shone since the war. What he discovered inside wasn't just a secret operation. It was the truth about a betrayal buried under 10 years of silence. A story of loyalty, redemption, and the light that refuses to die, even in the darkest storm. Before we begin, tell me where you're watching from, and don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more stories of courage, loyalty, and the miracles that still walk beside us through the cold. The storm had passed, leaving the coast of Maine carved in silence, the sky bruised with leftover clouds that refused to move on. The ocean no longer roared. It only breathed, slow and heavy, like something exhausted but unwilling to rest. Ethan Cross stood by the cracked window of his cabin overlooking the cliffs, a mug of black coffee cooling in his hand. He hadn't slept. He rarely did. Since leaving the Navy SEALs 3 years ago, sleep had become something that visited other men, not him. His nights were filled with fragments of gunfire, the screams of brothers lost in desert dust, and the voice of Commander Pierce echoing through his head like a broken radio. "You follow orders, Cross. That's how men live." Ethan was 44, tall, broad-shouldered, the kind of man whose presence filled a room even when he wished to disappear. His hair, once jet black, now carried streaks of iron gray, cropped close to a square jaw perpetually shadowed with stubble. His blue eyes had turned pale with time, like ocean water drained of light. He wore solitude like a uniform, moving through each day with mechanical discipline. Fix the net, mend the roof, check the tide. That morning, as he stood watching the restless gray horizon, something broke the monotony, a sound that didn't belong to the sea. It was faint at first, a whimper swallowed by the wind. He frowned, setting his mug down, listening. The second cry was clearer, fragile, almost human. Grabbing his coat, he stepped outside, boots crunching against frozen sand. The air smelled of salt and rust. As he descended the rocky path to the shore, the noise grew sharper, a desperate plea in the rhythm of waves. Then he saw it. Half buried in sea foam and debris lay a German shepherd, its fur matted with blood and seawater. One of its hind legs was torn open, a piece of twisted metal biting into the flesh. The dog trembled violently, but didn't bark, only whimpered, a low, hollow sound that made Ethan's chest tighten. He crouched, whispering instinctively, "Easy, boy. It's over." The dog's eyes met his, amber, deep, and painfully human, filled with exhaustion, but also something else, recognition. Ethan didn't know why, but he felt it immediately. This wasn't a wild stray. This was a soldier's dog. Years of field triage came back to him. He tore off his scarf, wrapped the wound tight, lifted the animal into his arms. The weight was solid, heavy with muscle, yet limp. Back inside the cabin, he laid the dog by the fireplace, fetched the first aid kit that never left his pack, and cleaned the wound with iodine and silence. The dog didn't fight him, didn't growl. It simply watched, panting shallowly, eyes locked on his face. When Ethan finally stitched the wound and set a makeshift splint, he poured water into a metal bowl and slid it close. The dog didn't drink at first. Then, as the firelight flickered across its coat, ash gray with streaks of black, it leaned forward, lapping weakly. "You're a tough one," Ethan muttered, leaning back against the wall. He studied the dog, male, about 5 years old, well-built, trained. The left ear bore a faint tattoo, military issue, though faded by time. A working dog, once belonging to someone who'd trusted it with their life. He sighed, rubbing his forehead. "Guess that makes 2 of us." He named him Echo because the animal made no bark, only that strange, hollow sound, like a voice calling from somewhere far away. The name felt right, like naming a memory that refused to die. For days, Ethan nursed Echo back to strength. The snow thickened outside, blanketing the coast in white silence. He fed the dog small portions of broth, adjusted the bandages, and spoke in quiet fragments about nothing. About the weather, the ocean, sometimes about the men he'd lost. Echo would listen, head tilted, as if understanding every word. At night, when the cabin grew dark and the wind rattled the shutters, the dog would lift his head and stare out the window toward the cliffs. Always the same direction, always toward Stonehaven Lighthouse. The lighthouse had stood dead for 20 years, a skeletal tower on the farthest cliff. Locals said it went dark after an explosion in the late 90s. No one went near it since. Ethan had never cared, until Echo came. Every night the dog would watch the distant shape through the fog, ears twitching, muscles tense. Sometimes he would let out a low, mournful whine that made Ethan's stomach twist. On the 5th night, Ethan woke to that sound again. Different this time. Urgent. Echo stood by the door, body rigid, tail stiff, eyes glowing amber in the firelight. The dog barked once, sharp, commanding. It was the first sound of authority Ethan had heard from him. "What is it?" he whispered. Echo turned toward the window. The fog outside was dense, rolling across the cliffs like ghostly smoke. Something in the animal's stance told Ethan this wasn't restlessness. It was purpose. He grabbed his flashlight and coat. "All right, show me." The wind cut deep as he followed the dog through the snow. Echo moved ahead with surprising strength, limping slightly but driven by instinct, stopping now and then to glance back, making sure Ethan was behind him. The path curved along the cliffs, the sea crashing below in silver foam. In the distance, the broken silhouette of Stonehaven Lighthouse rose through the mist, its frame black against the pale moonlight. When they reached the edge of the old road leading to the lighthouse gate, Echo stopped. He let out a sound Ethan had never heard before, a deep, trembling growl that carried grief and defiance all at once. The seal's pulse quickened. "What are you trying to tell me, boy?" The dog didn't move. He stared straight at the tower, ears flat, breathing hard. And in that moment, Ethan felt it too. A pressure in the air, a stillness too heavy to be natural. Something waited, out there. Something that had survived, just like him. He looked down at Echo and whispered, "All right, let's find out what's left of the light." Together, they stepped into the fog. Snow drifted sideways across the cliff road, whispering against the rusted guardrails and broken stone. The fog that clung to the coast had grown thicker, heavy as breath held too long. Ethan Cross adjusted the strap of his coat and scanned the faint outline ahead. the old Stonehaven lighthouse rising through the white veil like a ghost's spine. Its lantern chamber, once a beacon for ships, now stood dark and fractured. The world around him was colorless, a blur of gray sea and black rock, yet the dog walking beside him, Echo, moved with purpose, head low, breath steaming in the cold. Ethan's boots crunched against the ice, the sound unnervingly loud in the still air. His pulse thudded with a strange rhythm, not quite fear, not yet memory, but something heavier that pressed from the inside. He had been here before, in a way. Different battlefield, different terrain, but the same silence. The kind that came before finding something you shouldn't. Echo stopped near the gate, his tail stiffening. The iron latch was red with rust, but someone had oiled it recently. That detail sent a chill crawling up Ethan's spine. Someone had been here, and not long ago he crouched, brushing frost from the chain with his glove. "Easy, boy," he murmured. Echo's ears twitched. The dog's fur had begun to regain its sheen after weeks of care. Dark gray over his back, fading to pale silver along his sides. His right hind leg, once stitched by Ethan's steady hand, bore only a faint scar now. Yet in his amber eyes there was a strange sharpness, as if the animal was chasing ghosts only he could see. He gave a low growl, not of aggression, but warning. Ethan nodded once and pushed the gate open. The hinges shrieked. The sound seemed to vanish into the fog as soon as it was born. He raised his flashlight, a narrow cone of light cutting through dust and darkness. The door of the lighthouse was chained loosely, the lock half broken. When Ethan pushed it open, the smell hit him first, a mix of mildew, seawater, and something metallic, the unmistakable sting of burnt gunpowder. For a moment, he thought his mind was tricking him. The air was warm, faintly, unnaturally warm, as though someone had lit a fire here not long ago. The interior was cramped, spiraling stairs running along the circular wall. The floor littered with rope, broken lanterns, and rusted tools. Ethan moved carefully, scanning every corner. The beam of his light slid across the wall, revealing old graffiti, initials carved deep into the concrete. MT 1997. He froze. Miles Tanner, his old teammate. The name hit like a punch to the gut. Miles had died in Operation Iron Veil, or so the report had said. Echo padded ahead, nose low, tail sweeping cautiously. He stopped near a trap door, half hidden under a pile of rotting nets. His nails scratched at the wood, persistent. Ethan knelt, brushed aside the debris, and tugged. The hatch resisted at first, then lifted with a metallic groan. A rush of stale air escaped. Cool, dry, carrying the faintest echo of gun oil. The beam of his flashlight caught the edge of something metallic below. He climbed down the narrow steps, boots landing on concrete. The space beneath was small, a storage cellar, walls lined with dust and neglect. But in the center stood a neat row of metal containers, identical in shape, stacked too high. Each one bore a faint stamped line across its front. Property of Devgru. Ethan's breath caught. Devgru, his own unit. The elite Navy SEAL group that had been his home, his brotherhood, and later, his curse. His pulse hammered now, not from exertion but disbelief. These weren't random supplies. These were field containers used only for special operations, for weapons, evidence, or things never meant to exist on paper. He brushed his glove over the lid of one crate. The layer of dust was uneven. Someone had touched it recently. Echo sniffed along the floor, tail lowered, making soft whines. The sound brought Ethan back to another night, the one that ended Iron Vale. The desert had burned around them, the sky orange with fire. Two men, Miles Tanner and Avery Locke, had gone back to retrieve classified intel. Pierce had ordered the retreat. Ethan had argued, begged, disobeyed. But when he returned, the camp was gone, replaced by silence and smoke. He'd buried what was left of them beneath the sand, believing Pierce's word that it had been an accident. But here, 10 years later, his team's ghost had left fingerprints in a lighthouse no one had used in decades. He pried open the first crate. Inside were files sealed in waterproof bags, coordinates, communication logs, and a flash drive marked with a date, 0514. Iron Vale debrief. His throat tightened. He lifted another container, this one heavier, filled with field gear, some rusted, some pristine. On top lay a folded piece of cloth. When he lifted it, the embroidered tag read, Tanner M. Ethan closed his eyes, his jaw flexing. "You were here," he whispered. Echo circled the room, then sat beside him, pressing his head gently against Ethan's leg. The gesture was quiet, grounding. The man who had spent years running from ghosts now sat among them. He studied the flickering shadows from his flashlight. Every instinct told him to leave, to report this to someone, anyone. But the part of him that had survived battle knew what that would mean. Someone had hidden these files for a reason, and whoever they were, they hadn't wanted them found. Echo's gaze fixed toward the corner of the cellar, where a faint trail of footprints, recent, small, perhaps from a boot lighter than his, led up another narrow set of stairs, disappearing behind a steel door. Ethan rose slowly, gripping his flashlight like a weapon. His voice was barely above a whisper. "Someone's still here." Echo's ears flattened, a low growl rumbling deep in his chest. Ethan's heart pounded once, hard, steady. He was no longer just a man searching for truth. He was a soldier again, standing on the edge of another mission, one he never meant to take. He reached for the door handle, feeling the chill of steel under his palm. "Stay close, Echo," he murmured. "We're not alone." The night along the Maine coast had gone silent again. That deep kind of silence that lives after a storm, when the air is cold enough to make your breath visible and the world feels half asleep. Inside the Stonehaven Lighthouse, Ethan Cross crouched behind the rusted spiral staircase, his back pressed to cold iron. The faint tremor of approaching engines drifted through the fog, low and rhythmic, the way a helicopter's echo might carry through desert canyons. The sound of men closing in. His instincts sharpened. Years of Navy SEAL training had conditioned him to recognize intent by sound alone, and what he heard now was precision. Not the clumsiness of scavengers, but professionals. Ethan was 44, his face cut with lines that time and loss had carved. Beneath his thick coat, his shoulders remained square, his movements efficient. The scars on his forearm, pale under the dim beam of his flashlight, told stories no one would ever hear. He had once believed he'd buried his old life in the sand of Kandahar and the salt of the Atlantic, but the ghosts had found him. The dog beside him, Echo, lay low, muscles coiled, one ear twitching with every vibration from outside. The animal's fur, a mottled gray and black, shimmered faintly in the half-light, and his amber eyes tracked the sound with surgical focus. He was healing well from his earlier wound, though Ethan knew the limp would never fully vanish. Echo wasn't just an animal. He was a soldier reborn, carrying the same kind of haunted silence that Ethan did. The crunch of boots broke the calm. Through the cracked doorway, Ethan saw 3 men step into the courtyard, silhouettes wrapped in tactical coats, rifles slung tight across their chests. Their breath fogged in the air as they spoke in low tones, the metallic click of their weapons precise and familiar. Mercenaries. The leader, broad-shouldered and impatient, tapped his earpiece. The radio crackled. A voice on the other end, controlled and steady, one Ethan hadn't heard in a decade. "Pierce reporting in 5 minutes. Keep the site clear." The name froze his blood. Commander Nathan Pierce. Ethan's jaw tightened until it hurt. Pierce had been his commanding officer, a tall, square-jawed man in his 50s, with iron-gray hair and eyes the color of polished steel. Charismatic, unyielding, the kind of leader who could make men walk into fire believing it was duty. 10 years ago, Pierce was reported dead in the explosion that ended Operation Iron Veil. Ethan had carried that guilt for years, believing his own hesitation had cost his commander's life. But hearing that voice now, calm as ever, tore through the illusion. Pierce hadn't died. He had vanished. And if he was sending men here, it meant he had something to hide, something worth killing for. The mercenaries moved deeper into the lighthouse. One shined his flashlight along the stairwell, its beam slicing through the dust. Ethan's heart thudded once. He whispered to Echo, "Stay." The dog's body stiffened but obeyed, lowering his head. They waited until the footsteps passed the landing. Then Ethan moved, smooth and silent, down the lower steps toward the storage cellar. Every muscle in his body remembered how to fight. But his mind, that was where the war had never ended. Why here, Pierce? Why now? The cellar smelled of metal and sea rot. Ethan ducked behind a stack of DevGru crates, the same ones he had found hours before, his hand gripping the cold steel of his sidearm. He heard the mercenaries spreading out above, boots echoing against the hollow floor. "Check the basement," one of them said. The sound of a safety click followed. Ethan exhaled once, slow, deliberate. The first man came down, a lean figure with close-cropped blonde hair and a jagged scar cutting across his cheek. He was younger than Ethan by at least 15 years, but his eyes held the same practiced emptiness of a killer who had learned not to hesitate. Ethan rose from the shadows before the man could fully turn. His hand snapped forward, striking the rifle aside, twisting the man's arm and sending him crashing into the wall with a muffled grunt. Echo lunged at the same moment, jaws clamping onto the attacker's sleeve. The man shouted, trying to pull free. The sound carried upward. "Basement! Contact!" another voice barked. Gunfire exploded. The first bullet struck the wall near Ethan's shoulder, showering him with dust. He rolled behind a crate, returning fire in short, precise bursts. Controlled, measured. Echo darted between shadows, barking once, then vanishing behind a beam. A second man descended the stairs, heavier, built like a brawler, with a thick beard matted by frost. Ethan saw the man's eyes flare in the flashlight's glare, wide with adrenaline, just as he fired. The shot hit Echo. The sound that followed was not human, a sharp, guttural cry that made Ethan's vision tunnel. The dog stumbled but didn't fall. Instead, with terrifying speed, Echo lunged again, crashing into the gunman's chest. Both went down. The rifle clattered away. Ethan moved instinctively, disarming the last mercenary as he rushed forward. A brief, brutal struggle ended with Ethan pressing his forearm against the paw's throat, pinning him to the floor. "Who sent you?" he hissed. The mercenary wheezed, eyes darting toward the radio clipped to his vest. It buzzed again. Pierce's voice filled the room, calm as the sea. "Report. Have you secured the evidence?" Ethan froze, every part of him burning. He pressed the transmitter. "Yeah, Pierce. It's secure." His own voice sounded alien. There was silence on the other end, then a low chuckle. "You always were resourceful, Cross. Shame you didn't stay buried with the others." The line went dead. Upstairs, something shifted. Maybe wind, maybe footsteps. Ethan knelt beside Echo. The dog's flank was slick with blood, the wound high, but not fatal. "You're all right," he murmured, his hand shaking as he pressed a cloth against it. Echo looked up at him, panting, eyes full of that same fierce will he'd seen on the battlefield, the refusal to quit, even when the body screamed otherwise. Outside, the engines roared to life again. More men were coming. Ethan's mind raced. The evidence, the crates, the files. They were the reason Pierce was here. The reason Iron Veil had never truly ended. He grabbed the flash drive and stuffed it into his coat. The lighthouse groaned as wind battered the walls, the old beams shuddering like a dying heart. Echo tried to rise, wobbling, but still alert. Ethan rested a hand on his neck. "We finish this together, boy," he whispered. The storm outside had begun again. Faint snow drifting through the cracks in the doorway, mixing with the smell of smoke and gun oil. Ethan glanced up the staircase, hearing movement above. He tightened his grip on his weapon and breathed deeply, steadying the tremor in his chest. The ghosts of his past had faces now, voices, orders. There would be no running this time. The mission he thought had ended in the desert was waiting for him here, beneath the broken light of Stonehaven. He looked at Echo, whose tail gave one weak wag despite the pain. "All right, soldier," Ethan said quietly. "Let's end this." The wind screamed outside the Stonehaven lighthouse, slamming sheets of frozen rain against the walls. The ocean raged below, black and endless, waves crashing like artillery fire against the cliffs. Ethan Cross moved quickly down the narrow metal stairs, his breath coming in sharp bursts, his hand gripping the collar of the wounded German shepherd beside him. Echo limped but followed, determined, his paws clicking against the rusted steel steps. The dog's fur was darkened with blood near his flank, but his amber eyes stayed fixed on Ethan, alert and unyielding. Ethan knew that look. He'd seen it in soldiers who refused to die before the mission was done. The air in the lower chamber was damp and metallic, filled with the smell of rust and salt. Ethan slammed the heavy steel door shut behind them and twisted the latch. The lock clicked into place with a finality that echoed in the hollow space. His hands were shaking, not from fear, but from the surge of adrenaline that came after too many years of keeping it buried. He hadn't felt this alive since the battlefield. Yet beneath that clarity pulsed something darker. Guilt, the ghost that never left him. He turned to Echo, kneeling to check the wound. "Stay with me, boy. Just a little longer," he murmured. The dog licked his hand once, as if to say he understood. The room was lit only by the flicker of his flashlight, which wavered over walls lined with rusted tools, broken crates, and decaying ropes. In one corner stood the old electrical panel, its surface coated in grime. Ethan flipped the main breaker. At first, nothing happened. Then the lights overhead flickered, weak, reluctant. A low hum filled the room. Moments later, a distant rumble vibrated through the structure, and above them, the great lens of the lighthouse came to life. The first beam cut across the night, a blinding white ray that tore through the fog and stretched far into the sea. After 20 years of silence, Stonehaven breathed again. Ethan stepped back, staring upward through the open shaft of the stairwell as the rotating light illuminated the walls in rhythmic flashes. For a heartbeat, he felt something like peace. Then his gaze caught a strange seam along the far wall, faint, almost invisible, but deliberate. He moved closer, brushed away the dust, and uncovered the outline of a hidden compartment. A safe built directly into the concrete. His pulse quickened. He pressed his ear to the cold metal, listening. It wasn't locked by a code, just old-fashioned weight and rust. He pried at the hinge with a crowbar until it groaned open. Inside was a small military-grade hard drive sealed in a waterproof case, the type used only for classified operations. The label, faded but legible, read, "Evidence, unauthorized weapons transfer, Commander N. Pierce." Ethan froze. His throat tightened. He could almost hear the desert wind again, the crack of gunfire, the voice of Pierce barking orders over the radio. The truth hit him with the force of a round to the chest. The explosion that killed his team. The betrayal he'd buried beneath silence. Pierce hadn't been a victim. He'd been the architect. He ran a hand down his face, the stubble scratching his palm. Anger came in waves, not fiery but cold, precise like the sea itself. All those years of blaming himself, of thinking he'd failed his brothers, when the man who'd trained him had traded their lives for profit. "You son of a bitch," he whispered. His reflection glinted faintly in the metal surface of the safe. Gray eyes hollow, a face lined with the kind of wear that came from surviving too much. He almost didn't recognize himself. A sudden crash upstairs snapped him back. Boots, heavy, fast. Pierce was here. Ethan's instincts took over. He grabbed his rifle, slammed the hard drive into his coat pocket, and took position behind the stairwell. Echo's ears perked up, a low growl rumbling in his chest. The sound of metal scraping echoed from above, Pierce forcing the last door open. When he appeared, he was exactly as Ethan remembered him, only older, sharper, more deliberate. Commander Nathan Pierce filled the doorway like a shadow given form. He was in his mid-50s now, tall, broad-shouldered, his once dark hair streaked with silver. His face, angular and sun-cut, was marked by a scar running from temple to jaw, a reminder from a mission long past. His eyes were the same cold gray Ethan remembered, commanding, intelligent, and utterly devoid of guilt. He carried a pistol low and steady, the weapon of a man who'd used it too many times to hesitate. "Cross," Pierce said, voice calm, almost amused. "You were always too curious for your own good." Ethan stepped out from behind the stairwell, rifle leveled. "You left them to die," he said, the words coming out low, steady. Pierce's expression didn't change. "Collateral. You think the government didn't know? You think wars end clean?" He took a slow step forward. "You should have stayed buried, son." Ethan's finger hovered on the trigger, but his mind fractured between rage and restraint. Killing Pierce here would end it, but it would also bury the truth again, lock it forever under another lie. His mission wasn't revenge. Not anymore. He needed the world to see. Instead, Ethan turned and slammed a red lever on the wall. The emergency beacon control. The lighthouse's beam shifted instantly, flashing in a repeating pattern. SOS. High above, the signal pulsed through the fog, picked up by radar across the coast. The old lighthouse had become a cry for truth. Pierce's calm cracked. "What the hell did you do?" Ethan didn't answer. Pierce raised his gun. In that instant, time seemed to fold in on itself. The war, the betrayal, the years of silence. The muzzle flashed once, the sound deafening in the narrow chamber. But before the bullet found its mark, a blur of gray and motion collided with Pierce's chest. Echo hit him full force, teeth sinking into the fabric of his sleeve. The older man staggered backward, swinging wildly. The two figures slammed against the railing of the spiral staircase. "Echo!" Ethan shouted, lunging forward. Pierce aimed downward, fury twisting his features. "Loyal dog," he spat. Echo snarled, pulling hard. The railing groaned. A single gunshot echoed through the chamber. Then a crash. The commander's body tumbled into the darkness below, swallowed by the shadows of his own making. Silence returned, broken only by the faint hum of the lighthouse and Echo's heavy breathing. Ethan dropped to his knees beside the dog, hands trembling. "You did it, buddy," he whispered. The beam of light above swept across them again, cold and pure, washing the room in white. For the first time in years, Ethan felt the weight of guilt begin to lift. The light had come back, not to save ships, but to expose the truth. Outside, the sea roared, but it sounded different now. No longer an enemy, but a witness. Morning broke over the Maine coast like the slow lifting of a curtain after a long, dark act. The air is sharp with salt and cold, the kind that bit through the skin but somehow felt clean, a cleansing kind of pain. The sky, washed in hues of pale gold and blue, stretched endlessly over the restless ocean. Ethan Cross stood on the cliffside outside the Stonehaven lighthouse, his body stiff, his mind hollow, staring into the horizon where the first glint of dawn touched the waves. His coat was torn, his hands still bandaged, and his face, rough and unshaven, looked older than the 44 years that belonged to it. He had the kind of face built by endurance, hard lines along the jaw, a nose once broken in battle, and eyes that carried the gray of storms rather than the blue of calm. Every breath came slow, heavy, and deliberate, as though he were reminding himself that he was still alive. Below, the distant sound of rotor blades began to cut through the wind. The Navy helicopter appeared from the east, slicing through the mist, its black silhouette stark against the rising sun. Ethan raised his hand to shield his eyes as the aircraft descended onto the rocky plateau beside the lighthouse. The wind whipped his coat, stung his face with grit, and tore through the silence he had grown used to. When the side door opened, 3 figures emerged. Federal agents in dark uniforms, their jackets marked with faint insignias that caught the light. Leading them was a woman, Special Agent Claire Monroe. She was in her late 30s, tall and composed, with short auburn hair that the wind couldn't quite tame. Her face bore the sharp, intelligent symmetry of someone accustomed to command, though the faint lines at the corner of her mouth suggested a life that had seen more than paperwork. Her eyes were the color of cold steel, scanning everything with quiet precision. She moved with the poise of someone who had spent too many years balancing discipline and empathy, an investigator who knew when to press and when to listen. "Commander Cross?" she called out, her voice carrying above the rotor wash. "Just Ethan," he replied, his voice hoarse from hours of shouting and smoke. He handed her a sealed waterproof case, the same one he had taken from the hidden vault beneath the lighthouse. Her gloved hands closed around it. For a brief moment, their eyes met, and she seemed to understand without words the weight of what she now held. "This contains everything," Ethan said. "Pierce's orders, the transfers, the logs. Operation Iron Veil, it's all there." She nodded, her expression tightening. "We've been chasing whispers of this for years. You've done more than most ever could." She hesitated, glancing at the lighthouse, its great lens still spinning faintly, though the morning sun had outshone it. "Where is Commander Pierce?" Ethan looked toward the cliffs, where the rocks fell away into mist and sea. His voice was quiet. "Gone. The ocean keeps what it wants." It wasn't a lie. Somewhere below those waves lay the man who had once been his mentor, his commander, and his betrayer. Ethan felt no satisfaction, only a weary kind of justice, the kind that doesn't celebrate, only ends. The agents gathered the evidence, signaling to the pilot. As they prepared to leave, Claire turned back. "You could come with us, you know. Testify. They'll need your account." Ethan shook his head. "Everything that needed to be said is in that case. The rest belongs here." He didn't explain further, and she didn't press. Perhaps she saw it in his posture, that quiet stubbornness of men who've seen too much war to keep fighting outside of it. She gave a small nod, a gesture of respect, and boarded the helicopter. The blades thundered again, lifting the aircraft into the cold air. Ethan stood still as the wind from its ascent whipped around him, scattering dust and loose snow across the rocks. When the sound finally faded, silence returned. The kind of silence that belongs only to places where too many ghosts linger. He turned toward the lighthouse, its beam now fading in the daylight. By the steps, wrapped in a worn olive-green jacket, lay a small wooden box. He had made it himself the night before, from driftwood and metal scraps scavenged from the shore. Inside, wrapped in a tattered military scarf, was Echo. The dog's body was still, the fur brushed smooth, the face peaceful as though asleep. Ethan knelt beside him, resting a hand on the dog's flank. "You brought me home, boy," he whispered. His throat tightened, the words rough, fragile. "You did what no one else could." He buried Echo at the highest point of the cliff, where the beam of the lighthouse crossed each sunset. The wind tugged at his coat as he hammered a small wooden plaque into the earth. The engraving was simple, burned into the grain by his own hand. For Echo, the one who brought the light back. For a long while, Ethan stayed there, sitting beside the grave as the waves crashed below. His thoughts drifted like the tide, to the men he'd lost, the lies that had festered, and the strange mercy that had brought a wounded dog to his shore. The guilt that had anchored him for so long began, at last, to loosen. A year passed. Seasons rolled across the coast. Storms, summers, the quiet return of gulls. The world moved on as it always did, but Stonehaven remained, steadfast on its cliff. When Ethan returned, his hair had grown longer, his beard grayer, but his eyes were clearer. He carried no weapon now, only a small leather satchel of tools. Inside the lighthouse, dust had settled again, the air filled with the faint scent of sea and rust. He climbed the spiral stairs to the lantern room, his hand brushing the rail that Echo had once run beside. As the sun dipped below the horizon, he reached the top and flipped the breaker. The great lens shuddered, then bloomed to life. The beam swept across the ocean, steady, bright, eternal. Ethan watched it turn, his reflection caught in the glass. This time, there was no mission, no code, no orders. The light wasn't meant to guide ships anymore. It was a promise. To the fallen, to echo, to every voice that had been lost beneath the waves. And when the night settled, he whispered into the wind, "You found the light, old friend. I'll keep it burning." Outside, the ocean roared on, endless and forgiving. They say light was the first gift God gave the world, not just to banish darkness, but to remind us that even in the coldest storms, grace still finds a way through. Ethan thought he'd been forgotten by heaven, but through the loyalty of a wounded dog, he found proof that miracles don't always roar. Sometimes they arrive on silent paws. If you've ever felt lost, remember, every night has its dawn, and sometimes the smallest light is enough to guide you home. May God bless everyone watching this story. If it touched your heart, share it with someone who might need a little hope today. Drop a comment below to tell us where you're watching from. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and help us keep these stories of faith, courage, and compassion alive. Because sometimes, the miracle isn't out there. It's already beside us.